Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on how to apply the law on consideration to a contract law scenario. Tutorial, we're going to be looking at the Rachel and Gunther mini scenario. We're going to be recapping what the law on consideration is and looking at how we use that idea structure to get a nice answer to this question. As always then, let's start by looking at the scenario that we've been given. So Gunther owns a cafe employing two waiters, Bill and Rachel. Bill becomes unwell. To avoid having to employ any extra staff, Gunther promises Rachel a bonus if she'll do all the work by herself until Bill returns. Rachel works extra hard while Bill is unwell, but Gunther doesn't pay her any extra money. And you're being asked to advise whether Rachel has given good consideration for the promise. Before we start looking at the issues in this particular scenario, I think it'd be useful at this point just to recap what the law on consideration is. On this slide, I've got a summary of the law on consideration, but it would be a really good idea for you to go back and look at the other video tutorial that I've done on consideration, where I go through all of the law and all the rules of consideration in detail. So if you watch that again, so it's nice and fresh in your mind before you try and apply the law, you'll find it a lot easier. But we'll do a quick recap here anyway. If you recall, in contract law, consideration is concerned with the bargain of the contract. A contract is based on an exchange of promises, and each party to a contract must be both a promisor and a promisee. They must each receive a benefit and each suffer a detriment, and this is what separates enforceable contracts from what we call bare promises. Consideration is the price given in exchange for goods or services under a contract or a promise to do or not to do something in return. The price is usually money, but it can be anything that has value. And consideration of value is required to make the contract legally binding and must be given by the contractual party. It can't be given by a third party. So up here I've got a little summary of what I've just recapped there, that consideration is the price given in exchange for goods or services on a contract, either a detriment incurred by the person making the promise or a benefit received by the other person. And in order for consideration to be enforceable under the law, we have to consider these 5 rules. So these are the rules of consideration. The consideration must be sufficient but need not be adequate. It must move from the promisee. Existing contractual duty doesn't constitute consideration. Part payment of a debt is not consideration, and the consideration must not be passed. So we'll do a quick recap of these rules, and you'll find that when you're looking at scenarios, it might be that some of them are relevant to your characters, but not others. So as I quickly recap these, try and be thinking about what happened in the Rachel and Gunther scenario and see if you can identify which rules you'd have to be talking about in the exam on that scenario. If you remember the first rule, consideration must be sufficient but need not be adequate. This means that there's no requirement that the consideration must be market value, just providing something of value is given. So you could, in theory, give £1 in exchange for a house, and that would be valid. And that's because the courts are not concerned with whether the parties have made a good or a bad bargain. And they can't be investigating whether something's the right price, if you like. We've got Thomas and Thomas on that, where we had a nominal rent being paid, and that was enforceable. And Chapel and Nestle was where Nestle empty chocolate wrappers were seen as being sufficient consideration. So this is just telling us that as long as something of value is being exchanged, that's okay. Second rule is that the consideration must move from the promisee. If a person other than the promisee is to provide the consideration, the promisee cannot enforce the agreement. And that comes from the case of Tweddle and Atkinson. So this rule basically means that you have to be a party to the contract in order to enforce it. And if you remember what happened in Tweddle and Atkinson, it was 2 dads that were contracting on behalf of a bride and groom. But the bride and groom were not party to that contract. So when the 2 dads died, The groom could not enforce the contract between the two dads because he was not a party to it. Third rule here, existing contractual duty doesn't constitute consideration, means that if a party has an existing contractual duty to do an act, i.e. they've already got a contract to do it, that act that they're already contracted to do can't be used as consideration for a new promise. And that comes from Collins and Godfrey. And if you remember there, the guy was already subpoenaed to appear in court. So when he was then offered money to appear in court, that promise for the money was not enforceable because he already had an obligation to appear. There is an exception to that, which comes from the case of Williams and Roffey, and that's if the party goes beyond their existing duty or if the party confers a new practical advantage. Number 4, part payment of a debt is not valid consideration for a promise to release the debt in full, and that comes from Pinnell's case. There are 2 exceptions to that: part payment of the debt by a third party or by promissory estoppel, and that was where Denning created the rule in the High Trees case, if you remember that one. And our final rule is the consideration must not be passed. This means that a promise cannot be based upon consideration that was said, given or done before the promise was performed. And there is an exception to that though, and that comes from Casey's patent. So that's just a really quick recap then. Let's go back and have a look what the issues are for Rachel and Gunther. So when we look at this scenario, now that the law's fresh in our mind, we've got Bill and Rachel working in a cafe. Bill's sick, and then Gunther promises Rachel a bonus if she'll do all the work by herself. Now he promises her this before she does the extra work, so this is not a past issue. The issue is that Rachel is already employed by Gunther, so the real focus of this question is on existing contractual duty. So in other words, can Rachel enforce Gunther's promise to pay her more, or can she not because she's already contracted to do the work? Now that we know what the key issue is, let's have a look at how we would structure this using IDEA. So I'll just skip to that slide. So as always, we use the IDEA structure, and you're going to start by identifying who your claimant is and pointing out that they need to have given consideration. So in this scenario, we'd be saying Rachel must have given consideration for Gunther's promise to pay her more. You then define what consideration is. So consideration is the price given in exchange for goods or services under a contract, either a detriment or a benefit. And then you need to explain consideration with cases, and this is where you are basically writing out that summary slide that we were just talking through, putting in all your cases, explaining the different rules. And then we apply the rules to the scenario. And I've put apply each rule to your scenario where possible. It's not always possible to apply all of the rules because they're not all going to be relevant. And for us, because we're looking at a small mini scenario, the main focus of it is existing contractual duty. So try and apply as much as you can, but obviously focus on what's specifically relevant to your scenario. On my next slide, I've done a bullet point answer to the Rachel and Gunther scenario. You can ignore the little red ones, they're just a very rough mark scheme for if we were looking at this in class. So you can see I've done the I, D, E and A there, so you can see how I've structured it. Mine's very listy and bullet pointy. In the exam, you need to be writing in full sentences, and it's really useful on consideration to outline what's happened in the cases in order to show that you really understand the rule. So when you're talking about it must be sufficient but need not be adequate, say, for example, in the case of Chapel and Nestle, empty chocolate wrappers were sufficient consideration. Although they don't have obviously a high value, it is still something of value being given in exchange. So just by outlining some of the facts, it shows that you really understand the rules. And that's going to be particularly important when you're talking about rules that have got a general rule, like existing contractual duty, and then an exception to that rule. So by explaining the case, you can really show that you understand it. Okay, so in Williams and Roffey, outlining the fact that there was a practical benefit in avoiding a penalty clause in the contract. So don't write masses and masses, but do outline what happens in the cases to help make your point. Look at my application then. I've pulled out what's really relevant to this scenario. So I've identified that Rachel has an existing contractual obligation to work as a waiter or waitress, and so performing her duties wouldn't normally be seen as good consideration, Collins and Godfrey. So in other words, she's already contractually obligated to be a waiter. So Gunther saying, oh, I'm going to pay you a bonus for doing the same work, essentially, that would not normally be enforceable. And you could make the point here that actually, although we know she's perhaps going to have to do a bit more, working a bit extra hard, she's not really performing work that's significantly different or more difficult when she does, sorry, that should say Bill's work too. Just let me change that. Easy to get your characters muddled up. So she's performing the generic task of being a waiter, which is her existing contractual duty. However, on the other hand, Gunther does obtain some benefit or avoids a detriment when he offers Rachel extra money to continue working alone, because he's avoiding the need to hire an extra waiter. So we could apply the exception in Williams and Roffey. And if Williams and Roffey was held to apply, Gunther would have to pay Rachel the bonus. Now, a lot of the time in consideration, as with a lot of areas in law, we can't really give a definitive answer here. So what I've put is, if it applies, he'll have to pay the bonus, but I've put in brackets, it's unclear whether the benefit is big enough to Gunther for the court to accept that he's going to have to pay the bonus that he promised. So it's fine to say it depends or if it's held to apply. Okay, so in general, we'd say no, she can't enforce that promise. However, he has obtained a benefit of not having to employ someone else. So in theory, it could be enforceable using Williams and Roffey. Okay, so I hope that was helpful in showing you how you go about applying the law on consideration. Obviously, depending on the scenario, it might be different rules that you are talking about or focusing on. So I recommend that you have a go at using the idea structure that we've just been through on as many different mini scenarios on consideration as you can, so that you feel really confident in tackling this in the exam.